Having always loved Shakespeare's stories, our guest this week, director of the new film Juliet and Romeo, was excited to tell his own version of the bard's story of star-crossed lovers set in Verona, Italy. But when he sat down to decide on how he could put his own spin on the classic tale, he was inspired, like Shakespeare, by the history behind Shakespeare's story. And ultimately, he was surprised by what he found when he went digging around in the archives to discover the backstory behind this tale. Here today to share with us where Shakespeare got his inspiration for the 1590s version of Romeo and Juliet and how that history informed Tim's retelling of the story as a musical for his latest film, Juliet and Romeo, is our guest, writer and director of the film, Tim Scott Bogart. That's what's happening right now on That Shakespeare Life. When you watch Juliet and Romeo, this latest film based on Shakespeare's works, you will see plenty of historical aspects on film, including a focus on historical lighting and plenty of historically inspired costumes. While the film does, as even the best ones do, feature some anachronisms that will stand out for diehard Shakespeareans, especially in the songs, which are modern pop songs and not reflective of historical music. What you will also see is a reflection of what it might have been like for Shakespeare to bring the story to the stage in his lifetime. You see, the story of Romeo and Juliet predates Shakespeare, and the bard borrowed most, if not all, of his plot lines from these older versions. Now, I sat down with Tim Scott Bogart to ask him about what he learned about the history of Shakespeare's plays through his preparation for making his film, along with what information he discovered about the real people in Italy that this plot line was based upon, and some of the production realities of what it was like to interpret that history into a musical form for the 21st century. Here's what he had to say. Hello, Tim. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Such a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Cassie.
Shakespeare is credited with writing Romeo and Juliet because, of course, he did write this famous play. But there was an Englishman who wrote this story before Shakespeare did. Tell us about this history.
Well, the history is spectacularly fascinating. Of course, you're referring to Mr. Arthur Brooke, which is the tragical history of Romeus and Juliet. I actually started my career as a stage director. Actually, I started as an actor on stage, and then ultimately I moved into being a stage director. And the first things I directed was Shakespeare, and Romeo and Juliet was just one that came to me. We're talking about decades ago. Early on, it was a piece. I thought the themes were just so fantastic. Interestingly, while I just adore everything Mr. Shakespeare has ever done, I always kind of felt that Romeo and Juliet was sort of his poppiest play, right? Like if you think about it, it's one of the few things he really targeted towards a younger audience, which really wasn't, if you look at the breadth of his work, not normally the case.
Having a 14-year-old as your heroine helps with that, yes.
Well, it certainly does. Although interestingly, when you go down that road, then there's so much focus on the younger group that I think some of the elder group perhaps got a little short-shrifted. But I think I actually directed it 4 times. And ultimately, I think I failed. I think the reason I think that I failed is while I was doing it, I always found these moments that I felt, gosh, there's so much more to this relationship. There's so much more about Juliet and her mom. There's so much more about this relationship between Romeo and this other person that I always felt, gosh, if there was a way to have more, that would be interesting. And it always kind of haunted me. And so I moved on with my career. I got into film and time, did other things. And then things would happen. Like suddenly I walk in and see Shakespeare in Love. And I'm like, God damn it. That's brilliant. Why didn't I think of what that did? Tom Stopper did everything I would dream to be able to do.
It's a good movie.
Oh my God. Can I tell you something? If people remember it as a good movie, it is a spectacular film. And if people haven't seen it in a while, oh my gosh, they should. It's such a brilliant understanding of the craft of creation, of this incredible time of Mr. Shakespeare, of who he perhaps was, and the parallel of where that idea came from, well, not true, in Shakespeare in Love, was fabulous. And I think it's one of the best pieces in that space. But as a creator, I was like, he did more on that text than I wanted to. So it just kept coming back. And aside from the music, we can talk separately, it was my journey later in my career to really understand. It was interesting because as a director on stage, I didn't really go back and delve into where he got his story from. So it was a complete shock to me to discover, but for a couple little things, he came up with virtually nothing. And it wasn't just that he based it on one source material. as I started digging it, yes, Arthur Brooke, a UK poet, wrote this fabulous 78 page, if I recall, poem. And all the characters are there and the story points are there. So Shakespeare took the poem and, of course,
And it's
brilliantly.
not that far before Shakespeare either. Arthur Brooke
No,
wrote this
no,
poem in the 1560s, and Shakespeare was born in 1564. So this was
correct. And we think Shakespeare wrote it 95-ish, right, somewhere in that vein. And so, yes, Arthur Brooke was really early, but not that far apart from it. But then you go back a little bit earlier, and suddenly Arthur Brooke based his on all these Italian authors. And there's like 3 or 4 of them, some of them like Bandello, like really consequential pieces. As you go further and further back, you suddenly see Montague and Capulet become Montecchi and Capuletti. You sort of go back, I think it was an Italian author, Salernitano, who did Mariota and Gianosa. So the names and the battling families kept going back from Shakespeare to a UK poet, to a number of French authors and novelists, to a Parisian, and then ultimately back to some historical records. But even in there, and we reference this in the film, the character of the great Dante Alighieri, as I was starting to study the time and place that this was happening, to find out that the great Dante Alighieri, one of the great creators of all time, was having this weird relationship with the most evil pope perhaps ever, Pope Boniface, who was in power from 1301 to 1303 and was really trying to control the entire empire before there was in Italy. And this odd relationship between the Pope and Dante. Dante was excommunicated. And where did he go during this period where these events supposedly took place? Verona.
Shall we guess?
He was suffering. Dante Alighieri is suffering in Verona at the exact same time. And when you go and you look at what those events likely could have been, he could likely have been at the same parties with the Montagues and the Capulets at that time. If you look at, and by the way, this was the moment which I adored. I tried to put it in this film, but I have plans for it later. But he was also dealing with his own writer's block, Mr. Alighieri, trying to write a little thing called the Divine Comedy, which will eventually be written. It's over a 10-year period that he makes this massive creative work. But in there, you'll see him referencing the Montagues and Capulets about 200 plus years, 240 something years before Shakespeare was even alive. So when you go back historically, the amount of source material is rather extraordinary. And if you go back to the earliest part of the source material, you also start getting into historic public records, which during that time, it was only the church. The church was the only place that anybody felt there was any real historical documentation. There weren't really governments running at that time. There was much more nation states in this area.
Yes,
So
and I think we should clarify that when we're saying source material here, we're not talking about how old, well, not only talking about how old the story of Romeo and Juliet is, because it does go back well before Shakespeare. But when you look through some of the history that you're referencing, there were real people
correct. There were real people. There were
that had
real
these names,
families.
and we're living in
Yes,
Italy. So the stories are based on real people, and
correct.
so it all kind of comes together in terms of
Real
what
people,
influenced Shakespeare. Yeah.
real dynamics, all of those things.
I was able to see an advanced screener copy of this film. Thank you, Tim and Greg and the team there for sending me that. And I will give you my 10-cent review here. So take that for what it's worth. But it is visually very beautiful. And I love what they did with the lighting. Understanding the historical inspiration behind their artistic choices for the film makes some aspects that hit me a little weird at first make a whole lot more sense. And specifically, I'm talking about the 21st century songs here. They were fun songs, but it didn't really make sense to have these very modern songs with very modern lyrics put up next to the 14th century costumes and settings of the film as a whole. It was kind of jarring for me when I was watching the film, but after I talked with Tim, I was able to appreciate what he was trying to do with that musical choice, and that made it make a whole lot more sense. Now, there's a lot of historical aspects in the film for you to appreciate, but I'm going to put some warning labels for diehard historians of Shakespeare's England that this film is, first of all, not set in the 16th century like you may expect. It's based on Shakespeare's play, which was written in the 1590s, but the story Shakespeare borrowed from was set in the 1300s. So that's the setting that they chose for the film. So don't expect to see 16th century stuff on the film because it's not there. And then the story doesn't stick to Shakespeare's version of the storyline precisely, so don't expect that either. You'll see the old familiar faces like Mercutio, and I will say in this film, Mercutio was hands down my favorite actor in this film. He was a marvelous character. They did very good with Mercutio. Now, Tybalt and of course the Capulets are there and the Montagues are there, and there are specific nods to Shakespeare. For example, they do loosely follow his plot line, and they will throw some familiar lines from Romeo and Juliet into the play. So you'll catch those as they come out from the characters. But from the dialogue to the plot and even the scenery and choices of timing here, they're definitely telling their own version of the story. Now, what's fun about telling your own version is that you can throw some surprises in there that are not in Shakespeare's play. Now, and that was fun. For someone that has seen Romeo and Juliet probably more than any other of Shakespeare's plays, I know what to expect. At least I thought I did. But when I sat down and watched this film, it was able to surprise me because it threw in some choices that I didn't see coming. And I actually expect a lot of you to be divided over. I know that it asks some questions that we've always wondered here on the show about what would have happened if so and forth did this instead of that kind of thing, which is, I'm going to say, the theme of the whole film is to ask new questions and then play them out in a new plot line. And again, Tim tells you more about his approach and how he put all that together and the history that was based upon in our full podcast interview. Today was just a piece of it, but you can hear the whole interview on the podcast that will hit the channel June 16th. So subscribe to That Shakespeare Life to hear all of that. And of course, be sure to check out Tim Scott Bogart's new film, Juliet and Romeo. It stars Jason Isaacs, which you'll remember from Hogwarts fame. He plays Lord Montague, and then there's Rebel Wilson as Lady Capulet. So there's a lot of fun faces and cool times to be had, and it's a fun little jaunt into historical fiction on film is what this movie is about. So if you're into historical fiction and you like the 14th century and you like Shakespeare, then go check it out. I think you'll enjoy it. It's in theaters May 9th.